May 1943. The English countryside slept under a low ceiling of cloud and fog. But on one small airfield in Lincolnshire, sleep was a luxury no one could afford. RAF Scampton was alive. Floodlights pierced the mist, engines throbbed on the tarmac, and the scent of aviation fuel hung thick in the night air. Around the hulking silhouettes of Lancaster bombers, ground crews moved with quiet urgency. They checked propellers, adjusted cables, loaded a single massive cylinder into each aircraft's belly, a weapon no one had ever used before. Inside the briefing hut, the men of No. 617 Squadron stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces half lit by cigarette glow and map light. They had been told almost nothing until tonight. Now their young commander, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, only 24 years old, revealed what they were about to do. They were to strike the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Their targets, 3 of the most heavily guarded dams in Europe, Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe. To destroy them would flood factories, cripple power stations, and send shockwaves through the German war machine. But to reach them, they'd have to fly low, so low their bombers would skim treetops and power lines, their wings nearly kissing the surface of the water. It was a mission of impossible precision, born from an engineer's dream and carried by men who understood the odds. Outside, the wind pushed fog over the runway, whispering across steel and rivets. One by one, the crewmen looked at each other. A glance, a nod, a silent pact. Then they walked out into the night toward the waiting giants that would carry them into legend. The weapon they carried was unlike anything the world had seen. It came from the restless mind of an engineer named Barnes Wallis, a man who refused to believe that brute force alone could win a modern war. He had watched conventional bombing raids fail again and again to cripple Germany's industry. The factories rebuilt, the power returned, the war machine rolled on. Wallis understood that to stop it, he'd have to attack its arteries, the great dams of the Ruhr. They powered steelworks, supplied cities, and kept production alive. But they were colossal. Walls of reinforced concrete more than 100 feet thick. Hitting them head-on would do nothing. So Wallis invented a miracle. He designed a spinning bomb that would skip across water like a stone, roll down a dam wall, and explode underwater at its weakest point. It defied logic, part physics, part faith. Each bomb, code-named Upkeep, weighed over 9,000 pounds and had to spin backward at 500 revolutions per minute. Dropped from exactly 60 feet at precisely 240 miles an hour, it would bounce once, twice, 3 times before sinking and detonating at the perfect depth. It was genius, but it demanded perfection. To deliver it, a new squadron had to be created, trained to fly lower, faster and steadier than anyone before. That was 617 Squadron. For weeks they rehearsed over English reservoirs, flying so low that waves sprayed their fuselages and lights reflected off the bomber bellies. Pilots measured altitude not by instruments, but by 2 converging spotlights mounted beneath the plane. When the beams met on the surface, they knew they were at 60 feet.
Every second mattered. Every foot of height, every mile an hour, every heartbeat counted. What began as an engineer's experiment had become one of the most daring operations in aviation history. And now, as the clock ticked toward midnight, those experiments were about to become reality.
At 9:28 p.m., the silence over Lincolnshire broke. The first Lancaster thundered down the runway, its propellers cutting through fog like spinning blades of light. At the controls sat Wing Commander Guy Gibson, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his mind calculating every second of takeoff. Behind him, his crew, Flight Lieutenant Robert Hutchison as navigator, wireless operator John Polford, and gunners Warner and Trevor Roper worked in perfect rhythm, no words wasted. The bomber lifted, wheels folding neatly into the undercarriage. Moments later, others followed, aircraft commanded by John Hopgood, Mickey Martin, Dave Shannon, Les Knight, and Henry Maudsley, each man carrying not just a new weapon, but the weight of a nation's hope. From the control tower, engineers and mechanics watched until the sound of engines dissolved into the night. Over the English countryside, 19 Lancasters formed into waves and began their descent toward the North Sea. At 1,000 feet, Gibson gave the signal to drop lower, 600, then 300, then just 60 feet above the ground. The planes flew so low, their shadows skimmed rooftops and fields. Inside his cockpit, Hopgood grinned tightly, muttering to his co-pilot, "She's flying like a brick. Keep her steady." Every man in the formation knew the risks. A single wire, a tree, a gust of wind, and they'd be gone. Yet there was no hesitation. In those tense minutes, training overtook fear. The bombers roared across the channel like black phantoms skimming the waves, the cold sea mist spraying their undersides. For some, the reflection of the moon on water looked close enough to touch. The mission was in motion, and there was no turning back. Crossing into the Dutch coast, the calm shattered. The first bursts of anti-aircraft fire erupted ahead, black blossoms flashing against the clouds. Gibson's voice came through the radio, calm, clipped, commanding. "Steady, keep formation, maintain height." Below, tracer rounds arced upward, streaking past the bombers like burning meteors. Hopgood's Lancaster took a direct hit to the tail, the aircraft shaking violently. His rear gunner, George Gregory, shouted through the intercom, "We're hit, but still flying." Smoke trailed behind them, yet Hopgood held the course, jaw locked, eyes forward. To his right, Mickey Martin's crew skimmed low over the Zederzee, the sea's surface reflecting flashes of light like shattered glass. Navigator Les Munro, flying in another wave, felt his plane lurch as shrapnel tore through the fuselage. "Hold her, boys," he muttered, tightening his grip on the controls. "Hold her steady." Above the chaos, Gibson's formation cut inland toward the Ruhr Valley, weaving between searchlight beams that clawed through the sky. The Germans below were fully awake now. Sirens wailed, towns lit up with gunfire. In the rear turret of one bomber, Fred Spafford pressed his cheek to the cold gun sight, firing short bursts at the lights below. He couldn't see his hits, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was staying alive long enough to reach the dam. Over the intercom, Gibson spoke again, voice steady, tone unbroken. 5 minutes to target, eyes sharp. For the men inside those humming steel coffins, time lost all meaning. Ahead, framed in the moonlight, the massive black outline of the Möhne Dam emerged from the mist, the destination they had trained for, prayed for, and feared in equal measure. Every man in 617 Squadron understood this was the point of no return.
As the black shape of the Möhne Dam grew larger, Tension filled every cockpit. The target, once an abstraction on a map, was now real, a wall of stone and concrete stretching across the dark water. It looked impossibly large, impossibly still. From his lead position, Guy Gibson saw the moonlight reflecting off the calm reservoir and knew there would be no room for error. The dam was surrounded by floodlights and flak towers. Any deviation in height or speed could send the bomb skittering harmlessly across the surface, or worse, detonate beneath the aircraft itself. He steadied his Lancaster, adjusting the throttle with measured precision. In the bomb bay below, the great cylindrical upkeep bomb spun backward at 500 revolutions per minute, glowing faintly in the light of a single lamp. "Target in sight," his navigator said softly. Gibson's jaw tightened. "Right, let's go." He dropped altitude to 60 feet. The plane's belly nearly grazing the water. Searchlights swept across the reservoir, converging on his aircraft. Flak exploded around them, shaking the fuselage. Gibson's voice came through the intercom, calm but cold. "Steady, steady, bomb gone." The Lancaster lurched upward as the upkeep detached, bouncing across the surface like a skipping stone, each impact sending rings of ripples across the reservoir. Then it vanished beneath the dam. For a moment there was only silence, then a dull thud, followed by a vast churning plume of white water that rose like a geyser. Gibson circled back, peering through the haze. The dam still stood. The explosion had rocked it, but not broken it. "Hopgood, your turn," he radioed. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood swung his Lancaster into position, badly damaged from earlier flak. Smoke trailed from his tail as he lined up his run. "Hold her steady," he shouted to his co-pilot, John Minchin. The upkeep spun furiously beneath them, the aircraft rattling as they approached the drop point. They released, too late. The bomb struck the parapet and exploded in mid-air, the blast slamming into the plane. Flames engulfed the fuselage. Gibson watched in silence as Hopgood's Lancaster arched upward, then spiraled down in fire, vanishing into the reservoir below. For a brief moment, a parachute opened, then disappeared into smoke. The intercom was silent. One of his best men was gone. Gibson exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the dam that still stood defiantly in the moonlight. There was no time to grieve. "Shannon, Martin, your turn."
Flight Lieutenant Dave Shannon, flying one of the Australian crews, brought his Lancaster down so low the waves touched the fuselage. "We're right on it," his navigator called, voice steady but thin with tension. Shannon could see the floodlights crisscrossing ahead, search beams clawing at the darkness. He began his run, the altimeter trembling at 60 feet. Over the intercom, the bomb aimer, George Johnson, counted down the seconds to release. "Steady, steady, bomb gone." The upkeep skipped perfectly across the reservoir, 1, 2, 3 times, then struck the base of the dam. The explosion followed, brighter and deeper than before, the shock wave rocking the bomber even at full throttle. For a heartbeat, everyone held their breath. When the spray cleared, the wall still stood, but this time a dark gash was visible at its center. Cracks spidered out along the stone. "We've hurt it," Shannon said quietly, pulling up hard and banking away. Behind him, Mickey Martin prepared for his run. Martin's Lancaster came in even lower, almost impossibly so. His crew, Flight Sergeant Vivian Nicholson, Sergeant Deering, and wireless operator Les Knight, watched as tracer fire streaked over the cockpit. The upkeep dropped cleanly and struck true, slamming against the weakened masonry. The explosion was devastating. Gibson's aircraft, circling above to spot the results, was nearly tossed from the sky by the blast wave. As the smoke lifted, what they saw made history. The great Möhne Dam was collapsing. Water burst through the breach in a torrent of white fury, cascading into the valley below. Towns and factories, power stations and bridges all lay directly in its path. Over the radio, voices shouted in disbelief, some cheering, some silent. Gibson steadied his plane and spoke only 2 words: "Target destroyed." But the night was far from over. He turned toward the next objective, the Eder Dam, deep in the German hills. Behind him, survivors from the first wave regrouped and followed. Gibson's aircraft led the way once more, his voice guiding the others through darkness and fire. In England, far from the chaos, Barnes Wallis sat awake in his office, listening for news through a crackling radio. He had built the weapon, trained the squadron, and risked everything on the theory that seemed impossible. Now, alone in that silent room, he could only wait, each second stretching like a lifetime, wondering if his invention had truly changed the course of the war.
The black line of the Eder Valley appeared through the haze like the mouth of a wound. For Gibson and his remaining crews, reaching it meant threading their way through mountain ridges barely wide enough for a Lancaster's wings. The Eder Dam was harder to find, buried in mist and surrounded by steep hills that funneled the wind like a trap. From the cockpit, the valley looked calm, too calm. There were no searchlights, no flak towers, only the eerie stillness of a sleeping landscape moments before violence. No defenses, Gibson muttered, but no room to fly. The approach required precision beyond reason. To line up a bombing run, they would have to dive between the hills, skim the reservoir, then climb out again in seconds, a maneuver few pilots on Earth could survive. Dave Shannon went first, his bomber rolling through the valley like a falling star. His bomb aimer's voice echoed in the intercom. "Left! Left a bit! Steady! Bomb gone!" The upkeep leapt from the plane, skipped twice, and slammed against the wall, exploding in a burst of light. When the smoke cleared, the dam still stood. Shannon pulled up hard, engine screaming, and looped away into darkness. Now Henry Maudsley took his turn. He was younger than most, 21, but his crew trusted him implicitly. Their Lancaster descended through a curtain of fog, the water rushing beneath so close the spray hit the windows. The bomb spun wildly below, mechanical whine filling the cabin. "Hold it steady!" Maudsley shouted. They dropped, too low. The explosion hit them almost instantly. A sheet of flame swept through the fuselage. For a moment, the aircraft rose like a comet, then disintegrated into 1,000 fragments that rained over the valley. Gibson, circling above, said nothing. He had already lost Hopgood. Now Maudsley was gone too.
The silence that followed was suffocating. Then came less night, flying the last surviving Lancaster. He approached from the far side, banking so sharply the wings seemed ready to shear off. His bomb fell true. A thunderclap rolled through the valley as the Eder Dam finally gave way, collapsing under the weight of its own broken heart. The water surged outward in a roaring avalanche of foam and debris, tearing through fields and villages, drowning the night in chaos. Over the radio, Gibson's voice cracked for the first time, not from fear, but awe. "She's gone," he said quietly. "The Eder's gone."
The next target was the Sorpe Dam, but fate was already thinning their ranks. The survivors, exhausted and low on fuel, followed Gibson toward the new objective, a long earthen wall reinforced with concrete. Unlike the Möhne and Eder, it couldn't be struck head-on. Its design demanded a different approach. The bombers would have to fly parallel to the dam and drop their weapons along its length, a maneuver that required nerves of steel. Flight Lieutenant Joe McCarthy, an American serving with the RAF, volunteered for the attack. His Lancaster crept toward the Sorpe through low-hanging fog, the engine sputtering from earlier damage. Inside the aircraft, the crew moved mechanically, the bomb aimer calling out altitudes, the flight engineer adjusting throttles by feel. 60 feet, McCarthy whispered. "Hold it." The dam rose beside them like a shadowed wall of earth. They released the upkeep. It tumbled end over end, striking perfectly along the ridge before disappearing in a column of dust and smoke. When the air cleared, the Sorpe still stood, scarred but unbroken. They made a second run, then a third. On the fourth, McCarthy's voice was barely audible. "We're done. She's holding." By then, dawn was bleeding over the horizon. Gibson knew it was over. He ordered the squadron to turn for home. The bombers rose slowly out of the valleys, climbing back toward the faint gray light of the North Sea. The cost was staggering. Of 19 Lancasters that had left Scampton, 8 would never return. 53 men were dead. The radios were quiet, the cockpits filled only with the thrum of engines and the sound of wind against metal. Yet beneath the exhaustion there was a strange, hollow pride. They had done what no one believed possible, struck at the heart of Germany's industrial power and lived to tell it. As the English coastline came into view, Gibson's crew saw crowds gathered near the runway, waiting. The planes touched down one by one, their engines coughing, their paint scorched, their fuel nearly gone. When Gibson finally stepped from his aircraft, he looked neither triumphant nor relieved, only older. "We've done our job," he said quietly, "but we've left too many behind." Somewhere in that moment, across a fog-covered airfield, Barnes Wallis received the message that his invention had worked. The dams had fallen. Yet as reports of flooding and casualties came in, he buried his face in his hands and wept, for the success, for the loss, and for the terrible price of triumph. When dawn finally broke over England, RAF Scampton stood waiting in silence. Mechanics, radio operators, and officers stared toward the horizon, scanning the pale morning sky for the sound of returning engines. It came slowly at first, a distant hum, then a roar, until one Lancaster after another appeared out of the mist. Some limped in with holes through their wings, others barely flying at all. Of the 19 bombers that had lifted off into the night, only 11 returned. Ground crews ran alongside as the surviving aircraft touched down, their tires smoking against the wet tarmac. The first to land was Gibson. He cut his engines and stepped down from the cockpit, greeted by exhausted salutes and tearful smiles. He asked for a head count before anything else. One by one, names were called. Hopgood, gone. Maudsley, gone. A dozen others, unaccounted for, swallowed by the night somewhere over Europe. Gibson listened, eyes fixed on the ground, every name etching itself into his memory. Reporters would later describe him as stoic, but those who were there remembered his silence, how he stood apart for a long time, helmet in hand, watching the horizon where his friends had vanished. Inside the debriefing hut, maps were spread across tables, covered with circles and notes in red pencil. Officers gathered around Gibson and his surviving pilots, recording every detail of the mission while the air still smelled of oil and rain. One by one, they spoke. Shannon describing the wall of spray rising over the Möhne, Martin explaining how his bomb had found the perfect line, and McCarthy recounting the stubborn defiance of the Sorpe Dam. When the final report came in, the results were undeniable. The Möhne and Eder dams were destroyed. The Sorpe was badly damaged. Massive flooding had swept through the Ruhr Valley, destroying factories, power plants, bridges, and rail lines. Thousands of workers were displaced, and Germany's industrial output dipped overnight. The mission was a success, strategically brilliant, surgically precise, and morally complex. For Barnes Wallis, the news was bittersweet. He had proven that his weapon worked, yet the cost haunted him. In his office, he read the list of casualties and broke down, whispering, "I never meant it to cost so much." The weapon that had changed the war had also carved its price in human life. In the days that followed, headlines filled newspapers across Britain. Dams destroyed, daring raid stuns Germany. The public hailed 617 Squadron as heroes. Wing Commander Guy Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest honor for gallantry. Many of his men received distinguished flying crosses and medals for valor. Yet for all the recognition, the survivors carried a weight that no medal could lighten. They had flown through hell and returned with fewer brothers than they had left with. The official photographs show smiling faces and raised glasses, but behind them were men who had seen the sky burn and the water boil beneath them. In interviews, Gibson spoke little of himself. He praised his crews, saying it was teamwork, not bravery. When the film reels rolled through cinemas months later, The Dambusters, audiences cheered at the recreation of the raid, but the real men sat in darkened rows, watching ghosts of the friends they'd lost. The legacy of that night would outlive them all. The Dambusters raid, as it came to be called, became a symbol of courage and ingenuity. Proof that precision, not power, could shape the outcome of war. In later years, military historians would debate its true impact, measuring tonnage lost and factories rebuilt, but those arguments missed the deeper truth. What 617 Squadron achieved was something rarer than statistics. They had shown what human skill, discipline, and faith in one another could accomplish against impossible odds. Barnes Wallis would go on to design even greater weapons, but he never stopped visiting the graves of those 53 men. He said, "They were my sons, every one of them once." Today, at the Möhne Reservoir, the repaired dam still stands, its waters calm, its scars faintly visible beneath the surface. Visitors pause at the memorial that bears the names of the fallen, tracing the letters of Gibson, Hopgood, Maudsley, Shannon, and Knight. Men who flew low enough to touch the water and changed history with the echo of their courage. And as the wind rolls over the stillness, one can almost hear the faint hum of Merlin engines fading into the distance. A reminder of the night when 19 bombers left England and legends returned.